Great. I am particularly proud to present our next speaker, our keynote speaker, Dr. Daniel Joseph Polikoff. Dr. Polikoff is a poet, translator, literary scholar, and philosopher. In addition to his many journal publications, he has published 7 books of criticism, translation, poetry, and creative nonfiction. A Rilke scholar, he has presented on the poet at numerous venues in both America and Europe over many years. Dr. Polikoff has taught at Waldorf High School, Sonoma State University, and the California Institute of Integral Studies, the recipient of a PhD in comparative literature from Cornell University, and a diploma in Waldorf education from Rudolf Steiner College. He is presently an adjunct professor in the Jungian Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and Dr. Polikoff serves as core faculty at Kosmos Institute and helped design the Western esotericism curriculum, among other things. Daniel, take it away.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you for founding Cosmos and arranging this conference. I'm going to jump right in. The talk will take about an hour, which is a little lengthy, but I think there's lots of changes of pace, so I hope it will hold your interest. Sophianic pedagogy in the era of the polymath. Mankind can be explained by nothing less than the whole of his history. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The year 1603 stands out as a particularly notable one in the history of the West. Queen Elizabeth had ruled England for nearly half a century. Her death in March of that year ended an era and transpired against a background charged with extraordinary significance. The English public, writes Professor Ed Hinson, viewed the Protestant Reformation as a cosmic conflict between the forces of Christ and those of Antichrist. With the accession of King James I of England in 1603, the apocalyptic expectations of the English people reached even further heights. Astronomy and astrology, at this time one still spoke of these in one breath, intensified an almost palpable sense of the imminent end of the known world. On December 17th, 1603, Saturn and Jupiter formed a great conjunction in Sagittarius, the first such conjunction in the fiery trigon, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, since Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor in 800. The prior great conjunction in the fiery trigon, 800 years before that, roughly coincided with the death of Jesus Christ. No wonder so many persons attached profound significance to the configuration. No less an astronomer than Johannes Kepler commented extensively upon the phenomenon in his book heralding the supernova he'd just discovered, of the new star at the foot of the serpent, under whose rising began anew the fiery trigon. But why am I talking about 1603 here, now? It's true, of course, that the 70-year reign of the only other Queen Elizabeth ended a scant 2 years ago. It's true as well that just 2 years before that, on December 21st, 2020, and so exactly 4 years ago today, Jupiter and Saturn formed another remarkable great conjunction. This time, the planet's entrance into Aquarius, on the first degree of the sign, no less, marked the roughly 800-year transition to not the fiery, but the airy trigon. Saturn and Jupiter's 6 arc minutes proximity to one another in the heavens was the closest the two planets had been since 1623, the great conjunction that followed the celebrated foray into the fiery trigon 20 years earlier. How seriously should one take such connections? I leave that to your imagination. In any event, I have not yet finished my inventory of the significant events of 1603. That year also marked the birth of the man to whom, more than any other, we owe the linked ideas of religious liberty and democracy in America. It was Roger Williams who, responding to both Puritan and Anglican tyrannies, first advocated, in his own memorable phrase, a wall of separation between church and state. The notion of religious liberty was hardly popular in either England or the colonies, but a downright heretical one at a time when religious nonconformity regularly led to torture and death. It was also Williams who founded the Providence Plantation, which, under his leadership, transformed into the colony of Rhode Island, the first democratic government amongst the fledgling colonies that would eventually become the United States of America. It was in 1603 as well that a figure of no less renown than the Hamburg philosopher Johann von Wovern, the first three letters of whose last name spell wow, wrote the Polymathia Tractatio Integre Operis de Studi Veterum, thus introducing the word polymathy into the titular vocabulary of Western Europe. Polymathy, according to von Wovern, is to be understood as knowledge of various matters drawn from all kinds of studies, ranging freely through all the fields of the disciplines as far as the human mind, with unwearied industry, is able to pursue them. Our representative polymath, then, is introduced in the guise of a chamois hunter, one who roves widely over the fields and ridges of the mind in tireless pursuit of that elusive quarry called wisdom. If von Wovern introduced the word polymathy, the idea had been around for some time. One popular source tells us that many notable polymaths lived during the Renaissance period, a cultural movement that spanned roughly the 14th through the 17th century. Embodying a basic tenet of Renaissance humanism, that humans are limitless in their capacity for development, the concept led to the notion that people should embrace all knowledge and develop their capacities as fully as possible. This is expressed in the term Renaissance man, often applied to the gifted people of that age who sought to develop their abilities in all areas of accomplishment: intellectual, artistic, social, physical, and spiritual. The reference to Renaissance humanism here suggests an important feature of the ideal we are tracking, which is indeed a humanist rather than a theistic one. While not denoting irreligiosity, polymathy cuts against the grain of the Augustinianism that has so pervaded human thought and feeling in the Middle Ages. Whereas Augustine paired worship of the glory of God with pain cognizance of the depravity of man, the fallenness of human nature consequent upon original sin, redeemable only through the offices of the church, Renaissance humanism celebrated the grandeur manifest in our being, the illimitable creative potential indwelling human nature. The optative mood did not, however, connote a one-sided denial of the vice that shadows the human adventure. On the contrary, true attainment in art, science, or religion entails a pitched battle, the triumph of the human being's better, more godlike nature over the baser impulses that constantly bedevil the soul. Pico della Mirandola's classic essay, Oration on the Dignity of Man, often regarded as the manifesto of Renaissance humanism, provides one classic formulation of the gist of its central idea. Speaking in the guise of God, the master creator, Pico proclaims, "We have given you, Adam, no fixed seat or form of your own, no talent peculiar to you alone. This we have done so that whatever talent you may judge desirable, these same may you have and possess according to your desire and judgment. Once defined, the nature of all other beings is constrained within the laws we have prescribed for them. But you, constrained by no limits, may determine your nature for yourself according to your own free will, in whose hands we have placed you. We have set you at the center of the world, so that from there you may more easily gaze upon whatever it contains. We have made you neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that you may, as the free and extraordinary shaper of yourself, fashion yourself in whatever form you prefer. It will be in your power to degenerate into the lower forms of life, which are brutish. Alternatively, you shall have the power, in accordance with the judgment of your soul, to be reborn into the higher orders, those that are divine. I cannot here delve into the more esoteric elements of Pico's exposition. Suffice it to say that, as a syncretist who sought to synthesize Plato and Aristotle, the Mosaic and Christian teachings, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, the Chaldean oracles, and more, in short, virtually the whole corpus of philosophical and religious knowledge available in his time, those dimensions take Pico's vision of man far beyond the bounds of any narrowly secular notion of humanism. Concomitantly, Pico stands as just one instance of a general truth. Renaissance humanism finds its origin and ground in the recovery and devoted study of ancient texts and sources, especially classical Greek and Roman ones. From Petrarch's discovery of Cicero's letters, to Ficino's translations of Plato, to Raphael's School of Athens, Michelangelo's monumental sculpture, and Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Renaissance humanism would have been inconceivable without the classical humanism that preceded and prepared it. This truth bears upon our attempt to understand the idea of polymathy and its orbit of influence, including its relevance to the sphere of higher education. Polymathy implies more than an expertise in a multiplicity of domains, a goal that, if superficially conceived, easily slides into dilettantism. As in the canon of the Neoplatonic philosophy so central to the Renaissance, the true value of multiplicity depends not upon plurality alone, but upon the relation of the many to the one, recognition of the underlying unity that connects diverse fields of concern and comprehends them as aspects of one whole. Harmonic relation between the many and the one counts as the signature of not only Neoplatonism, but the ideal of beauty that informs so much classical culture. It does so because a sense of proportion, a ratio, provides the means by which the eye of the mind moves between, for instance, the many columns of the Parthenon to the sense of cohesive integrity that impresses the witnessing soul with the unity and power of the building, even if it stands in ruins. And just as those vertical columns connect the entablature and pediment silhouetted against the sky with a firm and regular foundation, the classical idea of man comprehends the human being as an integral unity of three fundamental elements: body, soul, and spirit. The almost preternatural beauty and power of much classical art consists in the harmony that enables the physical vessel visibly to embody a spiritual or divine idea in the personified form of a god, goddess, or noble human being. How does all this apply to higher education? Etymologically speaking, a polymath is one who has learned much. Wikipedia gives Homo universalis, or universal man, as a Latin equivalent. The original concept of a university, as the word itself implies, involves a cooperation of the many and the one. Seats of learning offered instruction in an array of disciplines with the aim of producing graduates who could contain a universe of knowledge in their own person. That array, however, was not disorganized. On the contrary, schools offered a curriculum based upon a study of the 7 liberal arts, the trivium and quadrivium, the arts of the letter and those of the number, so as to provide a diverse yet balanced education. The goal was not specialized knowledge, but rather the culture of human beings who might achieve the kind of integration of practical, creative, and intellectual capacities that would enable them more truly to know themselves and the world at large, and so master any particular domain of inquiry or enterprise that attracted their special interest. It was hardly accidental that university education was thus originally conceived along lines responsive to classical ideals. The very concept of the liberal arts, though only formally elaborated later, originated in Greece. At this juncture, I would like to offer a kind of poetic interlude, one intended to support the view that the ideas I have been amplifying here are not obsolete notions deservedly set aside in favor of more modern or postmodern perspectives, but rather principles reflective of timeless archetypal verities inherent in human nature and responsive to the innate dignity of man. I composed the following poem after visiting the exhibit Truth and Beauty, Pre-Raphaelites and the Old Masters at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco in the fall of 2018. The allusions to the lady and unicorn near the end of the poem refer to the famous sequence of tapestries known by that name hanging in the Musée de Cluny in Paris. Idealized portrait of a lady, Simonetta Vespucci as nymph, after Sandro Botticelli. I see, master, what drew you to her, why you devoted endless attention to this noble face and figure, the high, clear forehead, aquiline nose and mouth, eyes looking out, as if looking in to an unseen world more real than our own. Windows, truly. Who is she? This nymph with pearls of dew strung above cascading wavelets of red hair, her slender neck adorned by antique cameo, and bosom lightly lifted by the invisible thought of the heart. Who is she? Image of a new ideal? Renaissance lady of the unicorn? No magic creature places its forefeet gently in her lap. No lamb-like face appears in the mirror she does not hold. Even so, look, upon the crown of her head, no jeweled horn, but a ruby blossoming rose-like in the golden calyx, and a snowy spray of egret or heron feather, whiter even than her translucent skin, a braided tassel, much like the lady's, all signifying soul conscious of itself, embodied form wed to spirit, true beauty, human and divine. When I first saw Botticelli's painting, it struck me to the quick. It was not that I fell in love with Simonetta, Botticelli's favorite model, but the beauty of her image as rendered by the artist evoked a deep soul spiritual recognition, an attraction charged with Platonic eros. Although it is difficult to absorb much meaning from a poem upon first hearing, I hope that you can discern in it an echo of some of the ideas I've been speaking about, ideas that are afforded a different order of tangible immediacy in the imaginal world opened by the painting and poem, in the space, that is, of what psychologist James Hillman, one of the inspirations for Kosmos, calls the thought of the heart. That world more real than our own, is it not the mundus imaginalis, where ordinary boundaries of time and space, the distance, for instance, between Botticelli's era and our own, dissolve, fading into insignificance, even as the sharp outlines of objects in daylight vanish in the dreams of night? And the end of the poem, soul conscious of itself, embodied form wed to spirit, true beauty, human and divine. Is that not a poetic précis of the ideal ends of true, and we may say authentically higher education? I cannot, however, assume that my audience is in agreement with me here, or with respect to any of the points I have made so far. That is because I believe that so-called higher education today does not prepare one for the kind of experience I underwent with the Botticelli. Receptivity to the soul spiritual mystery manifest in the painting, and the imaginative capacity to explore that meaning in a companion work of art. The forces that dominate in university education today seem to me, on the contrary, to be ordered and arrayed, powerfully so, with infantry, cavalry, and artillery too, not only to subdue the honorable legions of truth and of beauty, but to be intent upon vanquishing them all together. How so? Well, one can start with the question as to whether persons whose hearts and minds have been shaped by prevailing academic norms today could even begin to see this painting or read this poem in any meaningful way. For to do so requires an underlying receptivity to the level of ideal or archetypal form exhibited, and a passionate desire to honor and explore that level of significance. In the case of a portrait like Botticelli's, this presumes openness to the inner as well as outer beauty innate in human being, what Pico calls the dignity of man. Yet it's precisely this dignity, the true beauty touched when one perceives the human soul in the light of the divine image that animates and shapes it, that so much modern philosophy, science, and social theory teaches us to regard as a destructive delusion. According to this theory, the ideal of classical beauty, like all kindred false universals, seduces us into ignoring or denying the virulent prejudices and systems of socioeconomic oppression that underwrite the whole of Western civilization. The enlightened scholar and teacher today recognizes that this civilization has, from the outset, been steeped in racism, sexism, colonialism, imperialism, and a host of other isms constitutive of what is today regarded as an irredeemably Eurocentric ideology. This mindset, the historic roots of which I will discuss later, exerts a profound influence on universities and so contemporary intellectual culture generally. Imagine, for instance, that I were to read my poem in a poetry workshop in an MFA program at, say, Columbia University. What do you think the response would be? More likely than not, the phrase, whiter even than her translucent skin, would draw intense fire, and the racist implications of the poem condemned. Or perhaps gender questions would roar to the fore. Can one today, in good political conscience, relate at all, let alone reverently, to Botticelli's idealized portrait of a lady? And finally, true beauty, human and divine. What on earth is that supposed to mean? Have we not been educated to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that all such transcendentalist notions are naught but empty rhetoric, masking, if not licensing, social inequities and oppressive ideologies that lurk beneath their shallow facade? Thus the court of academic opinion would summarily condemn my poem, and quite possibly my person, without even attempting to access and explore any authentic value it might hold. For such a good faith attempt would involve entering into a universe of concern not only foreign to the prevailing sensibility, but positively antithetical to it, and thus necessitating the surrender of a host of jealously guarded ideological presuppositions. The thought of the heart, a pretty phrase, James Hillman, but really nothing but a sentimental notion that cannot cut critical muster. Thus does the vocabulary of university schooling today repudiate the core of the liberal arts tradition. Thus does it turn its back on pedagogy designed to foster a balanced culture of the senses, mind, and soul, thereby enabling students both to envision and realize what is most noble and excellent in the human being, any and all human beings, not this or that class of persons. The classical tradition, along with the religious and esoteric streams that blend with it, teach that this perception of the ideal limbed with eternity does not posit as its ultimate end an otherworldly transcendence of the sphere of our strife-ridden social reality. It does aim to empower the student to know the good first rather than second or third hand, from the inside out rather than from the outside in. This in turn empowers the graduate to make better, more just and nuanced discriminations between good and evil. All such judgments rest, after all, upon the image of humanity harbored in one's heart, one's felt understanding of the enlightened ideals and aspirations proper to our nature. Yet modern schooling, eschewing the long path of soul-making, tends to jump precipitously to foregone conclusions as to what constitutes the true and the good. The beautiful scarce enters the picture, before focusing obsessively upon not the excellence, but the depravity of our nature, the evil-doing traceable to original sin, even if this is no longer interpreted a la Augustine, as sensual concupiscence, but, as per the doctrine of white fragility, racism, or some other ingrained form of oppression. I am not suggesting that race and gender-related concerns are not important subjects worthy of attention, nor do I mean to paper over or downplay the very real injustice at play in society today and throughout history. Yet the question for the pedagogue is, how might we frame a program of higher education so as to best empower each and every student, and by extension, every person whose life is touched by that student, to come to know themselves and realize their true and full humanity? That humanity, as is evident in every true work of art, is at once thoroughly individual and so responsive to the singular genius of that particular soul, and congruent with the universal dimension of our being that constitutes the ground of our shared humanity, our original and ultimate belonging together. It is a great impediment to that goal if the philosophy one follows rejects the very notion that a human being possesses not only a body, but as well a soul and spirit, and thus soul-spiritual dimensions of being and consciousness that transcend the plane of sense-based historical material reality. If one holds that human identity, along with everything else in the universe, is socially constructed from top to bottom, that all human consciousness can and should be reduced to calculations of intersecting lines of social force, upon what grounds can one even begin to appeal to any ethical ideal? How hold any truth to be distinguishable from illusion, any beauty distinct from repellent disfigurement? In such a flagrantly materialistic system of belief, we cannot claim that human thinking may be truly inspired, flow from any authentic logos, any angelic or Holy Spirit that guards and transmits the divine image and so the dignity of man. In such a system, we cannot hold that human feeling may be spiritually ennobled so as to transcend selfish egotism and participate in the beauty and grace radiating from any sort of sacred heart. In such a system, we cannot justifiably hold the citizen to the standard of virtuous conduct, for we have no sound loom upon which to weave and reweave the moral fabric of humanity. As we see only too vividly in the political arena today, one person's good is another's worst evil, and all submit to the only all too inhuman God still standing, the will to power. It's no accident that a Nietzschean phrase emerges here, for Nietzsche is part of the long story of how higher education and the human culture it guides has proceeded from there to here, from the wise ideals of liberal education to the STEM-dominated version of both scientific and social materialism that holds sway today, an educational system enthralled to a whole range of forces responsive not to the higher octaves of our nature, but to the opposite. While I cannot tell that story in detail, I will provide a few notes of the epic saga, one that features the early part of the 17th century as a crucial pivot in the unfolding plot of the human Odyssey. That century began with a symbolic bang, the burning at the stake of Giordano Bruno in Rome in 1600, augury of the fate of Hermetic philosophy in the West. The second decade saw the spectacular emergence of the Rosicrucian dream of a spiritual humanity premised on a culture that married religion and science, art and polity, a dream foreshadowed by the reign of Rudolf II in Bohemian Prague, likely the model for Shakespeare's Prospero. That year saw too the brutal crushing of that dream in the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. That same fateful year saw not only the Mayflower carry the first pilgrims to American shores, but the publication of King James's Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon's Novum Organum. Bacon's book, along with the decisive split of science and religion affected by the excommunication of Galileo in 1634 and the publication of Descartes' Discourse on Method, Cogito ergo sum, in 1637, heralded the scientific revolution. That revolution led in time to the ascent of a mechanistic science to a position of intellectual sovereignty, supremacy gained at the expense of not only the power and prestige of the church, but as well that of more spiritually sensitive, esoteric strands of science and philosophy. The backstory of our modern mindset naturally involves innumerable plots and subplots. An account of its special relevance, I'll mention here the professionalization and specialization of science in German universities in the early 19th century. This development, which left a lasting imprint on the disciplinary divisions characteristic of academia today, ran counter to the traditional, more liberal and universal spirit represented by Goethe's friend Alexander von Humboldt, who saw science and art as inseparable and nature as a living cosmos. The most famous scientist and explorer of his time, Humboldt's renown was exceeded only by Napoleon's. The name of the monumental book that recorded Humboldt's vision of the complex multeity in unity that comprised the whole of nature, the international literary and scientific sensation that influenced, among innumerable others, Emerson, Whitman, and Thoreau, simply and elegantly, Kosmos. Though Alexander von Humboldt opposed the compartmentalization of knowledge, Romantic science and philosophy was no more able to hold back the mechanistic tide than had the Hermetic philosophy that counts as Romanticism's intellectual and spiritual forebearer. The publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859 allowed the materialist imagination to invade and conquer not only the worlds of physics or physiology, but the previously sacrosanct domain of creation mythology, the humankind's imagination of its own origin. Science, the West's new faith, embraced a new narrative that does away entirely with the idea, ubiquitous in esoteric as well as exoteric traditions, East and West, that we owe the light of consciousness to a divine spark, the flame of which may be ever kindled anew. Man is, of course, not singled out for special treatment in this regard. The same deprivation applies to the universe entire. The very concepts of soul and spirit thus become, at first, questionable, and later intellectually indefensible, relegated to the rank of cranks, mystics, and the credulous masses lacking higher education. Somehow, however, the humanities, though mercilessly severed from the sciences in a manner violative of their original union, Remember that the quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, survived in the context of what C.P. Snow famously called the two cultures. Somehow, a semblance of that great Renaissance humanist tradition remained partially intact. One could still speak unabashedly of truth, beauty, and virtue in poems and stories in literature departments that read Shakespeare and Voltaire, Wordsworth and Dickinson, Du Bois and Douglas, Rilke, Woolf, and Dostoevsky as sacred texts bearing eloquent witness to the travail and triumph of human soul and spirit. That, however, was not to last. I entered Cornell University as a freshman majoring in biology in 1975, the same year E.O. Wilson published his magisterial Sociobiology. Richard Dawkins's The Selfish Gene appeared the very next year. Before Darwin, biologists had believed that evolutionary mechanics could account for all aspects of the human being's physical nature, as well as his basic instincts. But the realm of complex social and intellectual behavior had not yet fallen under the magic spell of scientific materialism. The 1-2 punch of Wilson and Dawkins changed that. What made the hypothalamus and limbic system? Wilson asks at the beginning of his book. His answer tells the gist of the whole sociobiological story. They evolved by natural selection. That simple biological statement must be pursued to explain ethics and ethical philosophers, if not epistemology and epistemologists, at all depths. The landmark developments in the field of biology in the 1970s found subtle parallel in literature departments, especially the English and comparative literature departments at Yale and Cornell. Jacques Derrida published his inaugural trifecta of texts, Writing and Difference, Voice and Phenomena, and Of Grammatology, in 1967. Derrida's post-Heideggerian critique of the logocentrism inherent in the Western metaphysical tradition struck a chord. A wave of deconstruction swept through select elite institutions, including Cornell, where I did my graduate work in Comp Lit. Despite nominal resistance by old guard humanists, reference or deference to transcendental ideals of any sort, once a staple of literary study, were soon scorned as intellectually untenable and ideologically suspect mystifications. Along with Derrida and other French theorists, Foucault, Lacan, Christeva, Althusser, the Holy Germanic Trinity, Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, were enshrined as the new gods of a literary critical corpse that had no stomach for the once celebrated dignity of man, and set about a systematic undermining of the humanist foundation of the liberal arts. The higher registers of spirit, soul, and body all came under attack. If the mind of man had, in its most enlightened register, once been conceived as the vessel of spirit and divine intelligence, Nietzsche declared the death of God and cast reason or intellect as a human, all too human organ of the diabolical will to power. Freud founded depth psychology by way of his epochal discovery of the unconscious, but his obsession with libido theory enabled his literary critical protégés to cast the human soul as irrevocably bound by the chains of sexual desire and the economy of socio-psychological power. For his part, Marx provided an unreservedly materialistic ground for the presiding vision of the workings of society. In the wake of this three-pronged assault upon spirit, soul, and body, man, like Noah drunk in his tent, was uncovered and shorn of his dignity. And our erstwhile American scholars came in like Ham, laughed to themselves, and went forth to tell their kin the sad and terrible joke. In modern times, unlike biblical ones, no Shem or Japheth came to put an end to the nonsense. The joke spread wide among the people. So it is that one cannot speak of the dignity of man or of the beauty of the soul without oneself becoming a kind of laughingstock of the guardians of higher education. I do not mean to imply that Derrida and Foucault, Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx have nothing to teach us, that these are the evildoers to whom we may ultimately trace our social ills. On the contrary, these are all brilliant, original, double-edged thinkers. I learned a great deal from Derrida in particular, whose work exhibits profound command of the philosophical tradition he critiqued. But do the academics who continue to build the world of higher education upon the ground he cleared read and understand him? In the early phase of the literary critical reception of Derrida, it was recognized that deconstruction rejected meta-narrative as a genre of thought that inevitably sweeps significant difference under the rug. Yet today we hear Western civilization criticized, if not summarily dismissed, by the way of an indefensibly reductive meta-narrative that casts all history and historical actors, no matter what the actual opinion of an Emerson or a von Humboldt might have been, in the mold of a single ideologically uniform story of oppressor and oppressed. Surely we can deploy some version of that story to deface Simonetta's beauty, so as not even to begin to think or feel what she, her image, might have to say to us. Surely we can find good reason why we do not have to contemplate the dignity evident in her person, or the mode of consciousness she bears with such grace and quiet power. Surely we do not have to attend to what it might mean to aspire to the ideal she represents, or undergo the ego death it may require to experience our own renaissance, a revisioning of our sense of what it means to be a human being. Let me try to bring all of these thoughts home to Kosmos and the vision of higher education that informs its mission. The Kosmos Charter enjoins return to the ideals inscribed in the original design of liberal arts education, a pedagogical program integrating the many and the one, the diversity of endeavor implicit in polymathic aims, and the underlying unity inscribed in the very concept of a university. Grounding this vision is the idea of the human being as, indeed, a cosmos, a microcosm reflecting the divine wisdom of creation, and yet challenged by the limitations of finite existence and the darker impulses that shadow and threaten to distort her nobler impulses. In accord with tradition, this vision conceives the human being as a threefold unity of body, soul, and spirit. Likewise, congruent with diverse teachings, Steiner, Gebser, Emerson, the yogic tradition, and more, we can recognize that the creative agency of our threefold human being manifests through a complementary triad of thinking, feeling, and willing. These faculties aim respectively at the spiritual ideals of truth, beauty, and goodness. If, combining these triads, we posit that thinking, feeling, and willing operate through the sensible, psychical, and spiritual dimensions of human being, we can imagine the unity of consciousness to be comprised of a ninefold character, which we can flesh out by identifying distinct, though not segregated, domains of human endeavor. Thus, the sphere of morality could be associated with the spiritual dimension of the will, what God or conscience determines ought to be done, while practical life generally and politics in particular would be associated with the embodiment of the will in deeds and transactions of power, what I do and how I do it to achieve a given finite goal. The spiritual dimension of our thinking would entail insight and discrimination into, a la Plato, the purely noetic reality of ideas themselves. What is truth or beauty or liberty? Thinking employed to discover the laws regulating the behavior of sensible phenomena, on the other hand, defines the domain of science. The whole ninefold gnosis can be schematically charted thus, and you can see the visual that Gallery has put up. And I thank her for her artistic representation of the ninefold gnosis. And I emphasize ad hoc and that the disciplinary distinctions indicated are heuristic and not meant as segregation, discretized. The disciplinary designations here are heuristic and should not be reified. The idea is not to discretize special disciplines, but to differentiate what Emerson calls the chambers of the soul, soul with a capital S here, and so in its inclusive sense, so that the underlying unity of its embodied soul spiritual agency may better be comprehended, and the end of an integral soul wisdom, a Sophianic gnosis, intelligently pursued. Of course, it is fair to challenge the utility of thus schematizing and portraying in boxes the ineffable wisdom secreted, like Isis behind her veil, in the innermost sanctum of our being. Yet from Plato's divided line to Tibetan and astrological mandalas and the Kabbalistic tree of life, schematic representations have provided insight into cosmic dimensions of consciousness which otherwise remain opaque and undifferentiated. Anthony Damiani, one of my teachers and the author of Astronoesis, stated that the vexing illusions suffered by human beings result from a constant unconscious confusion of thinking, feeling, and willing. That conflation affords the negative and destructive shadow dimensions of the soul's agency an upper hand. It fuels the intellect's tendency to murder by dissection or cleverly hatched self-serving plans, our feelings' inveterate tendency to nurse anger, fear, and hatred, and our will's almost irresistible desire for power, so consummately symbolized by Tolkien's ring. We can see this negative effect all too clearly in contemporary culture. The prevailing paradigm evinces the marked tendency to reduce all reality to atomized causes and transactions of physical, social, and political power. as per Lord Bacon's dictum that knowledge is power, mainstream thinking about nature or society is dominated by a will constrained by utilitarian ends, and science, the search for truth, enslaved by technology. The materialism inherent in such uncritical subordination of thought and feeling to unregenerate will forces denies the soul access to modes of consciousness, art, myth, or archetypal psychology that, if pursued with creative discipline, reconnect the energies of the body with the immaterial affections of the soul. It's certainly valid to conceive of the whole ninefold chart as symbolic of the capacity for wisdom, Sophia, inherent in the human soul. At the same time, a particular configuration within the chart possesses a special Sophianic resonance. Post-Kantian philosophers such as Schelling and Schiller realized that the path to freedom leads through beauty. According to Schiller, the human mind is torn between its desire for timeless truth, our Formtrieb or form impulse, and a contrary impetus, Stofftrieb, our matter or sense drive, that impels a desire to embody knowledge in concrete particulars. It is the aesthetic dimension of consciousness that moves between and mediates these poles of spirit and of sense. The distinct impulse associated with the aesthetic, which Schiller calls the Spieltrieb, or impulse towards creative play, thus assumes a central place in his philosophy. In kindred fashion, we may say that not art alone, but all the in-between realms of feeling and of soul, with a small s here, play a central role in the ninefold chart. If we sketch the outline of all of the sectors associated with either feeling or with soul, we discover a distinctive pattern in the center of the grid. This Sophianic cross constitutes the heart of the ninefold gnosis, and the domains involved, philosophy, religion, myth, art, and psychology, are crucial to the integral soul wisdom it envisions. Developing courses of study in the domains of Hillmanian archetypal psychology, myth, esoteric philosophy, music and magic, and literature and the arts, along with an astrology ready to reclaim with astronomy its historic place as queen of the sciences. All of this shows Kosmos Institute to be well on the way toward the goal of offering a curriculum commensurate with the whole integral vision. Coordination of the distinct polymathic pieces into a more universal whole will follow in due course. The mention of time refers us to another chief dimension of the Kosmos vision, one not so much structural as historical in nature. Kosmos is no trendy new age concoction, but is grounded in the stream of esoteric and imaginative culture, Renaissance artists, Hermetic philosophers, Rosicrucian and Romantic visionaries, and more, that constitutes an alternative modernity. This is the road not taken by mainstream culture in its schizophrenic embrace of scientific and social materialism on the one hand, and institutionalized religion on the other. I began this talk with references to the early 17th century. We likewise find ourselves in a time of battle, literal combat, and too, spiritual warfare in the shadow of apocalypse. Talk on that topic is now, as then, everywhere. A few weeks ago, on his podcast, Uncommon Knowledge, Peter Robinson conversed with PayPal founder Peter Thiel on the subject, Apocalypse Now, Ancient Prophecies and Modern Tech. The end times, intoned Robinson in his introduction. Armageddon, the Antichrist. If you suppose the only people who take those concepts seriously are snake handlers in the hollers of Kentucky, think again. The phrase end times conjures the image of a sudden and irrevocable catastrophe that, for better or ill, terminates reality as we know it. Yet the word apocalypse means, literally, a revelatory tearing of the veil. And the book of Revelation ends with a vision of the New Jerusalem, a shining city come down from heaven. Symbolically as well as literally, cities are human constructions that take time to build. Romantics understood that apocalypse, if not some dystopian annihilation resulting from monstrous human foolishness, but actual revelation, is not some external occurrence visited upon us, but takes place in and through the soul, the human mind and imagination. As the most recent noteworthy great conjunction suggests, we find ourselves at the cusp of a new age. The sign of Aquarius can portend the disembodied horrors of a global transhumanist technocracy and the associated risk of extinction at the hands of autonomous weapon systems, or the dawning of a new consciousness of what being human really means. The more positive alternative has much to do with the only kind of democracy destined to live up to Roger Williams's vision and so endure, that spiritual democracy grounded in respect for the transcendent worth of every individual human being and concordantly the spiritual community of all souls. It also must have to do with a renewal of the meaning and purpose of higher education. When asked by Peter Robinson why universities no longer seemed up to the task of asking the big questions, Peter Thiel remarked upon the excessive specialization, the siloing of knowledge characteristic of academic, especially scientific, culture today. Can such a fragmented culture help us understand Pico's vision of the dignity of man, or perceive the divine character of human consciousness glimpsed in the deep eyes of a purified soul, a lady with or without a unicorn, and so cultivate a genuine sense of what true beauty, human and divine, might look like? If the extant universe of academic culture, like the rest of the known world, is coming to an end, so be it. Perhaps Kosmos Institute may serve as one catalyst for a much-needed renaissance in higher education, and so play some small role in the effort to rediscover and recreate humanity in the image of the better rather than the worse angels of our nature. Thank you.